Alright, I recently picked up a copy of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. This is a very thick book, as you probably know. Interesting thing about this edition, this is totally irrelevant, but the interesting thing about this edition is it has like this Workers of the World Unite cover. Very strange for putting on The Wealth of Nations. But at any rate, I was looking through the table of contents. I have not read the whole thing at all. But lo and behold, he has a chapter called Of the Expense of the Institutions for the Education of Youth. It's about the effect of putting public money into the school system. It is unbelievable, unbelievable. Back in 1776, he saw all these things that people today can't see with all the evidence right before their eyes. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from this. Hopefully this isn't going to be as long as my memoir on pauperism video. That was awfully long. So he starts off talking about the endowments of certain large universities like Oxford. He attended Oxford, also the University of Glasgow. He talks about how these universities get money from sources that are not their students. And he asks, have those public endowments contributed in general to promote the end of their institution? Have they contributed to encourage the diligence and to improve the abilities of the teachers? Have they directed the course of education towards objects more useful both to the individual and to the public than those to which it would naturally have gone of its own accord? In every profession, the exertion of the greater part of those who exercise it is always in proportion to the necessity they are under of making that exertion. The greatness of the objects which are to be acquired by success in some particular professions may, no doubt, sometimes animate the exertion of a few men of extraordinary spirit and ambition. Great objects, on the contrary, alone and unsupported by the necessity of application, have seldom been sufficient to occasion any considerable exertion. The endowments of schools and colleges have necessarily diminished more or less the necessity of application in the teachers. Their subsistence, so far as it arises from their salaries, is evidently derived from a fund altogether independent of their success and reputation in their particular professions. In other universities, the teacher is prohibited from receiving any honorary or fee from his pupils, and his salary constitutes the whole of the revenue which he derives from his office. His interest is, in this case, set as directly in opposition to his duty as it is possible to set it. It is the interest of every man to live as much at his ease as he can, and if his rewards are to be precisely the same, whether he does or does not perform some very laborious duty, it is certainly his interest, at least as interest is vulgarly understood, either to neglect it altogether, or, if he is subject to some authority which will not allow him to do this, to perform it as carelessly and slovenly of a manner as that authority will permit. If he is naturally active and a lover of labor, it is in his interest to employ that activity in any other way other than the performance of his duty, from which he can derive no advantage. If the authority to which he is subject resides in the body corporate of the college or university of which he himself is a member, and in which the greater part of the other members are, like himself, persons who either are or ought to be teachers, they are very likely to make a common cause, to be all very indulgent to one another, and every man consents to his neighbor that he may neglect his duty provided he himself is allowed to neglect his own. In the University of Oxford, the greater part of the public professors have, for many years, given up altogether even the pretense of teaching. If the authority to which he is subject resides not so much in the corporate body of which he is a member, but in some other extraneous persons, in the bishops of the diocese, for example, or the governor of the province, it is not indeed in this case very likely that he will be allowed to neglect his duty altogether. All that such superiors, however, can force him to do is attend to his pupils a certain number of hours, that is, to give a certain number of lectures in the week or in the year. What those lectures shall be must still depend upon the diligence of the teacher, and that diligence is likely to be proportioned to the motives which he has for exerting it. An extraneous jurisdiction of this kind, besides, is liable to be exercised both ignorantly and capriciously. In its nature it is arbitrary and discretionary, and the persons who exercise it, neither attending upon the lectures of the teacher themselves, nor perhaps understanding the sciences which it is his business to teach, are seldom capable of exercising it with judgment. From the insolence of office, too, they are frequently indifferent to how they exercise it, and are very apt to censure or deprive him of his office wantonly, and without any just cause. Let's see. another section. He says, whatever forces a certain number of students to any college or university, independent of the merit or reputation of the teachers, tends more or less to diminish the necessity of that merit or reputation. And he talks about some of the bad teaching that results from teachers not getting money directly from their pupils. The teacher, instead of explaining to his pupils himself the science in which he proposes to instruct them, may read some book upon it, and by now and then making some occasional remark upon it, he may flatter himself that he is giving a lecture. The slightest degree of knowledge and application will enable him to do this without exposing himself to contempt or derision, or saying anything that is really foolish, absurd, or ridiculous. The discipline of the college, at the same time, may enable him to force all his pupils to the most regular attendance upon this sham lecture, and to maintain the most decent and respectable behavior during the whole time of the performance. The discipline of colleges and universities is in general contrived not for the benefit of the students, but for the interest, or more properly speaking, for the ease of the masters. Its object is, in all cases, to maintain the authority of the master, and whether he neglects or performs his duty, to oblige the students in all cases to behave to him as if he performed it with the greatest diligence and ability. Those parts of education, it is to be observed, for the teaching of which there are no public institutions, are generally the best taught. When a young man goes to a fencing or a dancing school, he does not indeed always learn to fence or dance very well, but he seldom fails of learning to fence or dance. And that's just the first 8 pages or so of about a 30-page chapter. Let me skip on to another good section here, if I can find it. In this section here, he describes the disadvantage that public schools give to private schools, saying that not only do the public schools essentially corrupt themselves, but they make private schools untenable and unprofitable and drives them out of business. So, let's see. In modern times, the diligence of public teachers is more or less corrupted by the circumstances, which render them more or less independent of their success and reputation in their particular professions. Their salaries, too, put the private teacher, who would pretend to come into competition with them, in the same state with a merchant who attempts to trade without a bounty, in competition with those who trade with a considerable one. If he sells his goods at nearly the same price, he cannot have the same profit, and poverty and beggary, at least, if not bankruptcy and ruin, will infallibly be his lot. If he attempts to sell them much dearer, he is likely to have so few customers that his circumstances will not be much mended. The privileges of graduation, besides, are in many countries necessary, or at least extremely convenient to most men of learned professions, that is, to the far greater part of those who have occasion for such learned education. But those privileges can be obtained only by attending the lectures of the public teachers. The most careful attendance upon the ablest instructions of any private teacher cannot always give any title to demand them. The endowments of schools and colleges have, in this manner, not only corrupted the diligence of public teachers, but have rendered it almost impossible to have any good private ones. Alright, so this is a really great little chapter. It's the first part of this book that I've read. If this is indicative of what the whole book is like, then I'm really looking forward to it. The entire book can be found online, so you don't have to even buy a copy, and I'll put up a link to this particular chapter. So go ahead and check it out, read the whole thing. It's good reading, it's quick, and it's very easy to read for having been written in the time that it was written.